Have you ever wondered what happens when you type a URL into a web browser and press enter? In this video, we will answer that question by setting up and running multiple services on our own server. We'll configure DNS records, set up and install an HTTP server, configure subdomains, reverse proxies, SSL certificates, and we'll also talk about how to manage long-running processes on the server. Now, this is the third video in a series on self-hosting. In the first video, we locked down and secured a VPS, and if you haven't set up a VPS and you'd like to, definitely check out that video. In the second video, I answered several of the questions that came up in the comments of the first video, and also talked about where to find a VPS if you'd like to get one. Now, even if you're not trying to run your own sites and services, the server we set up today can be used to host all kinds of self-hostable services, including things running in Docker containers. Now, if you're enjoying this series and want to see more, definitely let us know in the comments what you'd like to hear about next. All right, let's get into it. I'm CJ, welcome to Syntax. The first step in answering the question that we posed at the beginning of this video deals with DNS, or the domain name system. Now, this is a hierarchical and distributed naming system, but essentially what it allows us to do is to take domains and turn them into IP addresses. And for this tutorial, I purchased the domain notlocalhost.net. So this is mine, I bought it, and we can actually go to it. So if I go to it in my browser here, it loads. But one of the first things that needs to happen is my computer needs to turn this domain into an IP address. Now, I purchased this domain, notlocalhost.net, from namecheap.com. There are 1,000,001 places you can buy domains. You don't have to use Namecheap. You can use literally anything you want. Do your research, find something that you like. But once you've purchased a domain, you will have a space on the dashboard of wherever you bought it that will let you specify DNS records. And so in the next part of this tutorial, we're going to be specifying these records. So you need to make sure that you find that place in your dashboard. Now, I've gone a step further, and instead of using Namecheap to manage my DNS directly, I'm actually using a service called Cloudflare. So Cloudflare has a bunch of other things that they provide, but one of them is DNS management, and they do have a free tier. So I'm just using the free tier here. And this is where I'm going to be specifying all of my records. But to set that up, I actually set Cloudflare as my name servers for this domain. We're going to talk about what all this means in the next part of this video. But if you're going to be using Cloudflare, follow their onboarding, and they are going to have you set the name servers to point to Cloudflare for wherever you bought your domain. So for me personally, I'm on Namecheap. You can see I put my Cloudflare name servers right here, and this actually sets it up so that now, whenever I want to specify a DNS record, I'm actually going to do it here in the Cloudflare dashboard. Now, in order to point our domain name to the IP address of our server, we need to set up what's called an A record. So within our DNS dashboard here, we're going to click Add Record. The type is going to be A. So an A record is specifically pointing to an IP address. There are other types, but for now we're going to use A. And then for the name, I'm going to use the @ sign. So this specifies the root or the apex of the domain. So that's just notlocalhost.net with nothing in front of it, right? It's not www.notlocalhost.net or app.notlocalhost.net. It's just notlocalhost.net. And so this is the apex. Then the value you want to specify here is the IP address of your server. So I'm going to throw in my IP address here. Now, if you're using Cloudflare, they have this SSL proxy. We're going to disable this because we're going to be setting up SSL on our own server. The last part here is super important, and it's the TTL, or time to live. Now, when you're first setting up all of this stuff, you want to set this super low. I'm going to set this to 1 minute. And the reason we do that is because this is how long the values that we specify here will live in the cache of DNS. And so we're going to talk about in a second how all of that resolves and how all of that works. But if you set this to a high value, like 30 minutes or an hour, that means if you make a mistake, if there is a cached record, it's not going to check for the latest value until that time has expired. And so when we're first setting all of this stuff up, we want to go super low, like 60 seconds max. So that way, if we make a mistake and we need to update a record or add a new one, the value will no longer be in the cache, and it will retrieve the latest value. So we've got our A record. It has a value of @ and the IP address of our server. So we're going to click Save here. Now that this record exists, we should be able to query for it. And so to do that, we're going to use the command line. Now, I will mention, it is important that before you try to put this domain name into your browser, or before you try to make these requests from the command line like we're about to do, you want to make sure that this TTL is set super low already, because if you've made a mistake and this is too high, you're going to have to wait for it to expire. Now, from the terminal, we can use a command called dig. And so this command allows us to dig into the DNS records for a specific domain. And so we're going to run dig on the domain that we specified here. And so by default, dig will show us all of the A records. So if I do this, it comes back and it tells us that there is an A record for this domain that points to this IP address, and it has a time to live of 60 seconds. So there we go. So if this responds with this info, then we know that we've set the record and we're getting back the right value. Now let's talk about how this actually happens and really talk about the hierarchy of the domain name system. Now, when you have a domain, you actually have some root domain. In this case, it's .net. So if you have a .com, that's your root domain. If you have a .app, that's your root domain. But for my domain, the root is .net. And in order to resolve this, when my computer makes a request, it's going to first reach out to the root domain name servers, which are the ones that are in charge of .net. From there, they're going to respond with either further root servers, or they're going to respond with, oh, hey, I have an entry for notlocalhost.net, but it points to the name servers at Cloudflare. And then from there, we need to then query the name servers at Cloudflare that will eventually give us back this value here. And if you want to see this in action, you can actually do a DNS trace. So if we do dig with plus trace and then specify the record we want to find, so we'll do an A record for notlocalhost.net, we can see this process happen. And so we can see that it starts at the root. So it's grabbing the root servers for the .NET root server. And then from there are further root servers, where there's GTLD servers. And then from there, it's making a query to the name server entries that it found at one of these GTLD servers. And then from there, it makes the query here, which ultimately responds with that A record there. So anytime you're typing in a domain that isn't cached, meaning somebody hasn't gone there before, it's going to have to go through this process every time. And then when the cache expires, it's going to have to go through this whole process again. And so I'm actually going to wait 60 seconds to make sure that the cache is expired, and then we'll run it and we'll see that it's not instant. Because if I run it right now, it's instant, right? It's instant because it's living in the cache of all of these servers. But I'm going to wait 60 seconds. And then when I run it again, you'll see that it's not instant because it actually expired, right? Because we set that TTL to 60 seconds. So the next time someone looks up that domain, it's going to have to query that hierarchy again to finally resolve to the IP address. So let's wait 60 seconds, then I'll run this command again. Okay, it's been 60 seconds. I'm going to run this command again. But the other aspect of all of this caching and all these layers and hierarchy is that my machine, my computer here, also caches these entries. So my machine, whenever I make a query for notlocalhost.net, if the time to live hasn't expired yet, it's not even going to query these external servers. But okay, it's been 60 seconds. Let's run this command. And there we go. So because that time to live has expired, it had to go through the whole process of figuring out the final IP address again. So from here, I actually want to add one more A record. Now, it's very common that when someone tries to visit your website, they're going to type in www.notlocalhost.net. Now, in order for that to work, you need to also have an A record for the subdomain www. So let's do just that. So I'm going to add a record. The type is A, and the name here is www. And so that means when someone goes to www.notlocalhost.net, we want it to resolve to this IP address. So I'm going to turn off proxying. We're going to set that TTL super low and then save the record. Now, for this tutorial, these are the only records that we're going to need. But there are other types of DNS records. So one of them I'll talk about is CNAME. So if you're trying to point a domain to some service hosted somewhere, they might have you specify a CNAME record. So if you specify a CNAME is a record that points to some other domain record. So it doesn't point to an IP address. So let's just add an example here. I'm going to have banana. So banana.notlocalhost.net, but I want to actually point that to notlocalhost.net. And so this is a way of having an entry where maybe the IP address of the server changes, and you just want this entry to always point to whatever IP address that this one is pointed to. And so again, we'll set this super low, we'll save it. And now I have this banana record here. And when somebody looks it up, it's going to resolve to the domain notlocalhost.net. And then we would have to do a further query on notlocalhost.net to then find that it points to this IP address. But there are other types of records. There's also text records. Text records are very often used for like verifying your domain ownership. And these can have anything inside of them. And so you can put them at the root here, and you can put anything. So let's do this. So anything goes here. And then I'm going to set it to a super low TTL. We'll save it. And then let's actually query for these records from the command line. So if I query for www.notlocalhost.net and I do an A record, we should get back that IP address. Great. If we query for banana.notlocalhost.net and we specifically are looking for a CNAME record, we can see that it points to notlocalhost.net. And then if we want to grab the text records for notlocalhost.net, we can do this. And we can see that there's actually a record. It says anything goes here. And then there's this other record that's used for email servers. And I actually have email forwarding set up through Cloudflare. So that's why that record is there. Now, another thing you might want to consider is email routing. Now, this is going to vary widely based on where you bought your domain and where you're configuring the DNS. Like sometimes when you buy a domain, they give you like an email inbox and different things like that. But for my domain, I don't have that. And I set up email routing with Cloudflare. Other DNS providers support this as well. But essentially what I did is I set up a catch-all rule. So any email sent to anything at notlocalhost.net is going to be forwarded to my main email here. And they walk you through the settings here. You essentially just have to add some MX records. And so now any mail that comes into some address at notlocalhost.net gets routed through the Cloudflare servers, and then they forward that email onto my main email here. And so, yeah, there's no email inboxes or anything like that. It's just literally forwarding all of the mail. And this is nice because sometimes you might get emails for like TLS certificate expiration or something like that. So this is good to have set up in case someone tries to send an email to your domain and you don't have any sort of like mail server set up. Now, we just scratched the surface of DNS. There's so much more that you can dive into. Definitely check out this zine from Julia Evans. It's called How DNS Works. You can actually check out a preview, which dives into what we were talking about, this idea of the DNS hierarchy and like delegating to various servers. There's also this little comic here that talks about caching and how that works. So this is a really great resource if you want to dive deeper. And Julia also has this tool called Mess with DNS. So if you go here, you will get a temporary domain that you can actually set records for. And you don't have to worry about messing anything up. So this is super fun to play around and learn from. And then also Julia has this DNS lookup tool. So if you don't want to use the command line and you want to just see what records are set for a domain, you can plug it in here, click get me all the records, and it'll spit out like A records. You can see the like text records and stuff like that. Now, at this point in answering the question that we posed at the beginning of the video, we have an IP address. And so a computer will then make a request to that IP address. And so let's start working on the server itself. Now, in the last video, when we connected to our server, we specified the IP address. But now, because we've set up that DNS record, we can actually connect directly to that domain. So we don't have to specify the IP address directly. And as long as we've set that A record, this should work. Now, the first time you run this, you're going to get this warning just like you did the first time you connected to your server. But we'll allow this. This is going to put that domain into our known host file. So that way, if there's ever any sort of like man-in-the-middle attack, this will let us know about that. So that's going to put that in there. And now we can connect to the server. So that's one nicety of setting up a domain like this is not only for setting up websites, but I can actually SSH using that same domain. Now, at this point, the domain of the URL that someone is trying to visit has been resolved to an IP address. So the browser is now going to make a GET request to that specific IP address. And in order for that to work, there needs to be something listening on the other side. Now, the next part of this video, we're going to set up a proper HTTP server, but I kind of just want to show you what's happening under the hood before we do that. And for that, we're going to use this tool called Netcat. And so this is built into Linux, and it allows us to read and write to network connections. So we're just going to have a little netcat command that is listening for connections on port 80, because by default, when somebody tries to visit http:// domain, some path, this is actually by default connecting on port 80. 80 is the default port for HTTP. So our server needs to be listening on port 80. Now over here on my VPS, I do have port 80 open on the firewall. Now we talked about this in the last video. You're just going to want to make sure that you have port 80 open for this part to work. But we're going to use netcat, and we're just going to listen on port 80. Now, by default, you can't do that because 80 is a privileged port. So you do have to run this with sudo in order to listen on that port. Now at this point, we have a process. It's just sitting here, and it's waiting for something to connect on port 80. So back over in the web browser, if I click enter here, it has actually made that request to my server. And if we go back to the server, it literally received the request. So we can see that we got a GET request. So this client is is saying, hey, I would like you to return whatever is at the slash route here. And they're negotiating this over HTTP 1.1. That's the version of HTTP. And then there's a couple of headers that are specified here. It tells us like the type of device that they're on, what language they prefer, all this kind of stuff. And now our HTTP server can actually respond. And with Netcat, we can actually just type this stuff in directly. So I am going to say, hello, my client. I am responding over HTTP 1.1, and the status code of this request is 200, and everything is okay, and then hit enter. So that's actually responding to say, hey, everything's good to go. Here it comes. Here comes the rest. And then I need to specify some headers. And so I'm going to specify the content type header to let the browser know that I'm sending it HTML. So I'm going to do content type. And in this case, we'll just do text/HTML. And so now the browser knows that it's going to receive some text. Now I can just specify the body. So I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to do the body of the request. I'm just going to do some nice little inline styles. And then I'll specify just an H1 inside the body here. It'll say hello world. And then I can close out the body. And then finally, I need to close the HTTP connection to say that this is done. So I'll do this. And now the other side, the browser should have actually received that response. And it did. And so we can actually see that the browser rendered out that little hello world here. And if you open up the network tab in your browser, you can kind of inspect this a little bit more. You can see that it shows us what the status code is. It shows us the version of HTTP. It shows us that actual header that the server responded with. Now, it would be very cumbersome if we just had to sit at our VPS and respond to every request coming in. And so that's what an HTTP server is for. And so the next part of this video, we're going to set up Caddy, which essentially we can have running on our machine 24/7. It can automatically respond to these requests and automatically route those requests to the correct application or folder, depending on the request that comes in. Let's talk about web server software because there are a lot of options. I'll link to this page that has a bunch of options, and I'm going to talk about some of the more popular ones. So Apache HTTP has been around for a very long time, and it's the A in the LAMP stack: Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. There's also something called Nginx. I've been using Nginx for years. I probably have the most experience with Nginx. There's also something called Traffic Proxy. It's nice because it has this built-in web dashboard. You can see all of your running services. You can configure them from that dashboard as well. And there's also Caddy Server, and that's what we're going to use in this video. Now, I'm new to Caddy, but so far I'm loving it. It's super easy to install, super easy to configure, and it has this idea of secure websites by default. So whenever you create a website configuration, it can automatically procure a TLS certificate from either Let's Encrypt or Zero SSL, and it does that seamlessly. So it's super easy to get a site with HTTPS up and going. And these days, every site is running on HTTPS, so you definitely want that. Now, in this tutorial, I am going to talk about the concepts of the things that we configure with Caddy in a general way as well, because all the stuff we can do with Caddy, we can do with these other web servers, things like serving up static websites, reverse proxies, URL rewrites, URL redirects. All of that's possible with any web server software, but we're specifically going to be doing it with Caddy. Now, another interesting thing about Caddy is if you are coming from another web server, they actually have config adapters. So you can actually take your existing Nginx configurations and then adapt them to run with Caddy, which is pretty cool. Also, check out episode 340 of Syntax. So the creator of Caddy, Matt Holt, was actually on and had a chat with Wes and Scott. So if you want to learn about the origins of Caddy, definitely check that out. But yeah, in this tutorial, we're going to be using Caddy, so let's get into it. Now, the reason we want a web server like Caddy running on our server is we want to be able to have multiple applications and websites running. And Caddy and web servers like it are essentially like the gatekeeper. So Caddy is going to be listening on both port 80 and 443 for HTTP and HTTPS traffic. And depending on the request that comes in, it will serve up the correct website. So we might have a folder of static files that we want to serve at the root domain. We might have a Node.js API running on port 5000, and we want to reverse proxy requests coming into api.rdomain.com to that Node.js app. We might have a single page application running that is static files that need to be served up at some other subdomain. But Caddy is basically the gatekeeper listening on 80 and 443 that's redirecting those incoming requests, so that way we can have multiple sites running on the same server. Now let's talk a bit about how to navigate the Caddy website and also the different ways that you can run Caddy. So when you look at their website and you look at like getting started and also these tutorials, typically they are walking you through using Caddy directly from the command line. So you install Caddy, it's a binary, and then you can just run it from the command line. And they also walk you through potentially like creating a Caddy file in a folder and then using the Caddy CLI to run that configuration with the Caddy server. And so the Caddy command line tool has a lot of options, and that's one way to run Caddy, but we are actually going to install Caddy as a service. So we typically will never be directly interfacing with this command line. We're not going to be running any Caddy commands. We're going to do everything through config files. So in the next section of this video, we're going to run through the install, and we're going to do the install that actually installs Caddy as a service, so it's always running in the background. And then from there, we're going to set up our configuration so that it lives in one spot. And then anytime we want to change a website or add a website, we just change our config in one spot and then reload the Caddy service. So we're not running multiple instances of Caddy, and we're not really using Caddy from the CLI. The other thing is there are other ways to configure Caddy. They have this JSON structure you can use to configure. We're specifically going to be using the Caddyfile. And then also you could actually use the API. So whenever you install Caddy, it's actually running this admin API in the background, and you could make HTTP requests against that API to configure your website. But everything we do is going to be done through Caddy files. And so specifically, if you're following this tutorial here and you want to start to learn more about how to change the websites that we're configuring, you're going to want to look in the Caddyfile reference section. So this shows you all of the various concepts, all of the various directives that you can use within a Caddyfile. And this is where you're going to find the stuff that you need. If you're in the tutorial, it might get confusing because they say like run Caddy from the command line. We don't want that. Caddy's running as a service. We have all our configs in one location. And if we want to change those configs, this section of the docs here has everything we need to add new websites or change the behavior of those websites. Now, the beginning of this tutorial is just going to focus on getting up and going with Caddy and learning about the config file and modifying it and things like that. But we're going to focus on a static website to do all of those things. After that, we'll jump into hosting other kinds of websites, like a node.js application via a reverse proxy. But initially, we're going to focus on learning about the Caddy config and just serving up a static website. Hello there, CJ from the future here. I have a quick correction to make. So in this tutorial, you're going to see me running sudo service caddy restart. And when you're first setting up the server, this is fine because restart technically stops the Caddy service and then restarts it. So technically you have a few milliseconds of downtime for your website. The Caddy architecture, however, does support this reload command. And what this does is it keeps the Caddy service running and then dynamically reloads those configurations so you don't have any downtime for your websites. So in the future, as you're adding to your configurations and adding new websites, make sure that you use the reload command. I will link to the documentation that talks about managing configuration and the idea of how they're able to do this config reload. And then also in the section of the docs on keep the service running, they talk about using that reload command as well. So for this tutorial, it's probably fine to use restart, but you should know in the future, especially once you have a bunch of sites running on your server, you should use the reload command instead of the restart command. Now let's install Caddy. If you go to caddyserver.com, you can click on documentation, go to the install section, and we're going to be installing for Ubuntu. So we're going to click on this. Now they give us some commands we can run. This will add the Caddy repository to our package list. We'll update our package list, and then we will install Caddy. So I'm going to copy these commands and then run them on my VPS. We do have to run this under sudo, so I'm going to type in my password. Great, that has finished. Now, when you install Caddy this way, it is going to install a service, so it's always running in the background. You can see that in the docs here, it's telling us that it is running that systemd service. Now, to check that it is installed, we can just do a caddy-v, and that'll tell us which version we have. And if we want to see if the Caddy service is running, we can do a sudo service caddy status, and we should see this green dot here, and it should say that the service is running. Now, at this point, Caddy actually automatically starts up just a static file server. And if you go to your domain in the web browser, it should load up this Caddy congratulation page. And it actually tells us that we can put our files in here, and this will actually serve up this static site, and we can edit our configuration here. So let's do just that. We are going to edit this file and add some basic configurations so that we can get a better setup here. Because one thing that will happen is if I attempt to visit the IP address of my server, you'll see that it just shows the bare IP. You'll notice it's not running over HTTPS. So let's add some of those configurations so that by default, we're getting HTTPS. We're redirecting HTTP traffic to the HTTPS domain. Let's set that up. In order to do this, we need to edit the Caddy file. So I'll do nano and then the name of the file. Now, this file is actually in a privileged location. We need to be root to be able to edit this, and you'll see this error down here in nano. So we need just to make sure that we run this command under sudo. So if you do sudo bang bang, that'll rerun your previous command using sudo. Now, we want to edit this. And you can see right now, it just has port 80, and it's saying we are going to have a static file server that is just running on port 80. And what we want to do is we want to run this over HTTPS, and we want it connected to our domain. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just change this to be our domain name. So I'm going to add not localhost.net. And that's literally all we have to do. So I add this here, restart the service. Caddy will provision a TLS certificate, and then we should be able to go to notlocalhost.net over HTTPS. So let's give that a try. So I'm going to save this file, and then I'm going to restart the Caddy service. And from there, if I attempt to visit this, you'll see that it redirects to the HTTPS site, notlocalhost.net. So just like that, I already have a site running over HTTPS, which is kind of wild if you're used to configuring things in other ways. And one thing you'll notice is if you try to visit your website by putting in the IP address, it's going to try to load that over HTTPS, and we don't want that. One thing we want to do is redirect that to the root domain. So that way, if for whatever reason someone's ever trying to put in this IP, it just redirects to our domain. So let's set up that rule. So here in the Caddy docs, you can see that a website can have a redir directive. So what we'll do is we'll actually edit the Caddy file to add a new website and add this redir directive on it. Now to set this up, we can just actually modify the existing Caddy file. And if you go in here, you can list as many websites as you want in this file. Now, in a second, I'll show you a better way to do this so it makes it easier to manage. But for now, let's just add another website. So I'm going to add a website that corresponds to the domain here. And I'm actually going to throw port 80 on there. So when a request comes in for this website over HTTP, we're going to redirect to our notlocalhost.net over HTTPS. So I'm going to use that redir directive. And I'm going to say HTTPS:// and then specify the domain that I want to redirect to. So localhost.net. And then if for whatever reason they had like some path on the URL, I can just append it here by doing URI. And so if they went to like some path or had like a query string, that's just going to append it over HTTPS now. So we'll save this. We'll restart the service. And now when we attempt to visit the site over HTTP, it should redirect us. So let's give that a try. It might still give us this error. And if it still gives us this error, we just need to make sure that it doesn't use the cache. So if you open up the DevTools and then make sure you have disable cache checked, now if you try visiting that site again, won't load it from the cache, and it'll actually get that redirect back to the root domain. Now we're going to set things up so that our websites are easier to manage, because I could put everything in that same Caddy file, but that's going to get hard to manage the more websites I have on this server. So what we're going to do is create 2 directories, and I'm going to need to be root to do this. So we're actually just going to drop into a root shell. If you do sudo su, that is now going to drop you into a bash shell, and all the commands you're running now are as root. And we want to create 2 directories here. We're going to create a directory called sites available. This will have all of the Caddy files for sites that we potentially want to enable. And then we're also going to have a directory called sites enabled. Now, with these 2 directories, we're basically going to put all of our Caddy files into sites available. And then if we want to enable a website, we're going to create a symlink into the sites enabled folder. So let's just, for now, copy that Caddy file into sites available. And then we're going to edit that Caddy file. So if I just do a nano of sites available in that Caddy file, I'm going to remove everything except for the redirect here, because this file is only going to be specifying redirect. So I'm going to save that. And actually, I'm going to rename it too. So if we go into the sites available folder, I'm going to move that Caddy file into a file called HTTP redirects. Now you can call these files whatever you want, but every file that exists in this folder will potentially be loaded in as a website. So I renamed it. Now the sites available folder has an HTTP redirects file. If we look inside of it, it has that one redirect inside of it. So now I actually want to modify the main Caddy file and remove that redirect. So I'll use nano again. We'll go down here and actually just remove this section. Now, in order to actually load those configurations that are in separate files here, we can use the import directive. So if I say import, I can specify a directory name. In this case, we're going to do sites enabled. and then I can use a glob pattern. So I can just do /star. So any file in the sites enabled folder should be imported in here, and we'll actually load that website configuration. So I'll close this, save it out. And now we're ready to create a link. And so I know I ran a bunch of commands here, but let's just walk through what your system should look like. So if the root Caddy file here should only have the definition of your main website and then an import of sites enabled. And then inside of sites available, you should have a file called HTTP redirects, and that should have just the one directive that redirects the IP address to the main site. And then right now we don't have anything in sites enabled. That directory is completely empty. So if you're following along so far, now we can actually create a link to this file that lives in sites available, and we're going to link that into the folder here inside of sites enabled. So for that we can use the ln command, and this allows us to create symbolic links. So I'm going to create a link. We do -s, and we specify the file that we want to link to, and I'm going to put the full path in. So if I do etsy/caddy/sites available/http redirects, I want to link that file to a file in this sites enable folder with the exact same name. So we'll specify the full path, Etsy Caddy sites enabled, and then we'll call it HTTP redirects. Now, if you did this right, if you do an ls-l, you should see this file, but you're going to see this little arrow, and this means we have a symbolic link. So this file is actually pointing to this file over here. And so if I edit the file in either place, I'm actually editing the real file that lives over here. And what's nice about this is if I ever want to disable this website, I just have to delete this file, but I didn't lose my settings. That still exists over there in the sites available folder. All right, with all of these changes, we can now restart the Caddy service, and it should work in the same way. It should have the redirect and everything else. So let's just do a service Caddy restart. And now let's try visiting the site via IP address, and it should still redirect us. So if I try to go to the IP, it still redirects. So the main Caddy file is actually loading in that other file. Now, another redirect that I want to add is I want to redirect www.mydomain to the root domain. Because right now, if you go to notlocalhost.net, that redirects to HTTPS. That's perfect. But if I go to www.notlocalhost.net, this is actually a subdomain. This is a separate domain from the root domain. And you'll see that we're getting this very similar error that we got earlier with the IP address. And that's because it's trying to load www, but the SSL certificate has not specified that www is a valid name in the SSL certificate. And what we want to do is any request that comes in here, we want to redirect it to the root domain. Now, you can go in either direction. You could set it up so www.yourwebsite is the main domain, and then you could redirect without www to www. But we're gonna do the opposite. I like having the root domain here. There's some opinions around which one you should prefer and which one you should do. I like having the domain without www, but that's just my preference. So what we're gonna do is if someone goes to www, we're gonna redirect it to notlocalhost.net. And for this to work, we do need an A record here for www, right? Because someone goes to www.yourdomain, we want that to resolve to this IP address, but then our server needs to redirect them to the HTTPS version without the www. So to do this, we'll edit that same HTTP redirects file. So here inside of sites available, we're gonna modify this file, and you'll notice I'm still in a root shell, so I don't have to use sudo here. And what we're gonna do is just add another domain to the list here. So you can actually have as many as you want, and they can be space separated. So I'll just do www.notlocalhost.net. And this should work as I want. So if you don't specify the port, this now will work for both HTTP and HTTPS. So if someone goes to https://www.localhost.net, that's going to redirect it to the root domain. And similarly, if they go to HTTP, that'll also redirect it over HTTPS to the root domain. So I'll save this. Let's restart Caddy. And we should be good to go. So let's visit www. Sweet. So the redirect happened. And you'll notice if you look in the URL bar here, there is no www. So when we went to www, it redirects to the root here. Now I realize I'm saying www a lot. If you've already commented that the fact that I'm saying www, then great. So at this point, let's replace the default website that's loaded here by Caddy. Now on the page, you can see some details as to where they tell you you should put your files and how you can update things. So let's do just that. So over here, I'm in the Etsy Caddy folder. And if we take a look at the Caddy file, we can see our main host block here, and it has the file server directive. So this tells it that it should serve up static files. And then right here, it tells it where it should serve those static files from. So right now, our site is being served from user share Caddy. Now, if we go to user share Caddy, we should see an index.html, and this is the actual file that's being served up at the default website. But we don't want that. We're going to create our website in a common location, so that way that's where we'll put our files instead of here in the user share Caddy folder. So to do this, I am going to create a directory at var/dub. So I'm going to cd into var, and I need to make a directory called dub, but I will need to be root to do this because this is a privileged folder. So I'm going to do sudo make dir dub. And now if we go into dub, we have this directory, and this is where we want to put our websites. So typically what I like to do is I have a separate folder for every static website I am serving. And this folder is just for static websites. For other types of websites, we'll talk about that later, and we'll put those in a different spot. But for static websites, they're going to live in this folder. And so let's say I want to create that static website that's hosted at the root. I'm going to create a directory called the name of the domain. So in this case, not localhost.net. And right now, I will need to be root in order to make that directory because otherwise I wouldn't have privileges to create it. But I want to be able to edit the files inside of here as my current user, as CJ. So I'm actually going to change the owner of this folder because I will be using the CJ user to manage this folder. Now, the way you set the permissions here is up to you. I would say a best practice is to have var dub owned by root and the root group. And then for each website, you'll set the settings accordingly. One of the main things you don't want to do is you don't want to have this folder writable by the web server itself. So the web server Caddy is running under the Caddy user, and we do not want the Caddy user to be able to modify the files inside of here, because if the server ever gets compromised, we don't want them to be able to modify these files. So I'm going to change the owner to be my user, CJ, and then everyone else will have read access to these files, but only I will have write access. So to do this, I'm going to do a sudo chown, so change ownership, and I'm going to change the ownership to CJ and the group to CJ. So instead of root, it'll now become CJ. And I'm going to do this on the not localhost.net folder. Now, if we take a look at it, we can see that CJ has read, write, and execute privileges. The group CJ has read and execute privileges, and everyone else on the machine has read and execute privileges. So this setting right here is especially important because we want the Caddy user to be able to read the files that are in this directory. So now if we go in here, because CJ is the owner of this current directory, I should be able to create files in here without using sudo. So if I do a nano of index.html, I don't see an error here in nano that says I don't have permission. So let's just try out a little hello world real quick. So I'll throw in an h1, Control X, and then Y to save it. So I was able to create that file here in the not localhost.net directory. And because I created it, I'm the owner of it. But right now, my default UMask makes it so that when I create files, other users on the system do have read access. So I especially at least need to have read access for other users so that the Caddy user can read this directory and read this file. So now that I have this folder set up, let's actually update the Caddy config to point to this folder. So to do that, we'll go back up to Etsy Caddy, and then we want to modify that Caddy file as the super user. And right here where it says user share Caddy, we're going to update that to be var dub, and then the folder that we created. Now I'll save this, and then we will reload the Caddy server. So if I do sudo service Caddy reload, that'll look at those configurations, reload it without stopping and starting the server. And now it should be reading from that directory. So if we go back and we refresh, you can see that it says hello world. So we know that it's working. It's now reading the files from that directory instead of the default directory. Now let's actually get our website files onto the server, because we don't want to just be using nano on the server and like copy paste all the files. We actually want to transfer those files over. And there are a couple of ways to do it. The first way I'm going to show you is with the tool called SCP, or Secure Copy Protocol. So here on my local machine, I'm going to use the scp command to transfer the files, and this does it over SSH. So if you do scp and then specify each of the files that you want to transfer, and then specify an SSH connection, so I'll do cj at notlocalhost.net, this will transfer them to that host. Now, we can also specify where to put them on the host here. So you use a colon and then specify where you want to put them. And in this case, we're going to put them in that folder we created so far, www.notlocalhost.net. And so if we do this, it is now going to transfer each of those files over SSH to the server. Now, it's important that we had the permissions set up like we did in the previous section of this video, because we were transferring these files under the user CJ. So the CJ user needs write access to that folder in order to create these files over SSH. So you do need to make sure that whoever you're connecting as over SSH has write access to this folder if you want to load those files in. But at this point, we should be good. So we don't actually have to restart or reload the server, because we just changed the files in the directory here. So if we go back and refresh the page, we can see that the new website is getting loaded with the latest files that I added there. Now, another tool we can use to transfer files is called rsync. And so rsync is built into a Mac. It's also built into most Linux distributions. And to demo it, I'm actually just going to remove the files here, because rsync is smart enough to only transfer files that have changed. So we're going to start with nothing. So we just have a completely empty directory. Now over here on my machine, I'm going to do rsync. Then we'll specify some options. So we have -a, which means copy all of the file attributes, including like symlinks and stuff like that. Z will use compression. Capital P will show the progress of all the file transfers. We then want to specify where do we transfer the files from. So I'm going to drop into a subshell here and say transfer the files from the current working directory. So that'll give us the full path of the current working directory. And then I'll do a slash. Now the slash is important because I'm saying copy the files in this directory, don't create the directory on the other side, but copy the files from in this directory to the destination. And the destination is an SSH connection. So we'll do cj at notlocalhost.net and then a colon, and we specify where do we want to put the files on that remote server. And in this case, we'll do var www.notlocalhost.net. Now, for the destination, we do not put a trailing slash. And what this means is all the files in this folder will be copied into the folder that exists on the server here. Now, this is important because of like file permissions, right? So earlier we created this folder and we made sure that the CJ user can write to it. That's why we're copying into the folder and not trying to create it, because we wouldn't have the permissions to do that. And at this point, we'll go. And look at that. So we can see the file transfer progress of each thing. If we go back over to the server and list it out, we can see that the files got created. But one of the nice things about rsync is it will only transfer files that have changed. So if I run this command again, you'll notice that it considered all the files, but it didn't actually transfer anything over because none of the files are out of sync. And so this is really nice, and it's a nice and quick and easy command that'll just sync up a directory. Now, the next way I'll show you to sync files to the server is by using Git. Now, this is my preferred method of syncing things because I use Git for all of my codes. And if things change, I can just push up to the repo and then pull down on the server. Now, the first way I'll show you requires that the repository is public. I'll show you how to do this for private repos next, but if you have a public repo that you want to host on a server, this is how you can get it going. Now, the first thing you'll need is the clone URL. And you want to make sure that you grab the HTTPS URL because we're not going to be using an SSH key. The next section of the video, I'll show you how to set this up. But for now, we're just going to grab this and do a read-only clone. Now, I could attempt to clone, but if that folder we're trying to clone into is not empty, then Git isn't going to be able to clone into that directory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this directory and just assume that we're kind of starting from scratch, that we want to clone this directory from scratch. So what we'll do is we will remove notlocalhost.net. But I'm going to have to be root to do this because it's in var-dub-dub, which is owned by the root user. So we'll use root to delete that folder. Now, it's an empty directory. We will use root to create an empty folder. So we're going to do make directory of notlocalhost.net. So we're going to create the empty folder that we want to clone into. Now, in order to clone into this, as the CJ user needs to have read and write privileges to this folder. So to do that, we will change the ownership of the folder. So we'll use sudo change the ownership of this empty directory to be our user and then the group. So the owner will be CJ, the group will be CJ, and then specify the folder. So now I have an empty directory that is owned by CJ. And so if I go in here, there's nothing in here. and you actually can clone into an empty directory. So now I have a completely empty directory. It's owned by CJ, which means I can clone into it as the CJ user. So if I do a git clone here and then specify that HTTPS URL that we grabbed, it'll write it into that folder. Now, if we go in there, it exists. So we should be good to go. If we go back and try and visit the website, it still loads just fine. Now, one of the issues of doing it this way is that .git folder exists inside of that folder. And because we haven't locked things down, if someone were to request /.git/ say head, for instance, they can actually access all of the files inside of that Git repo. And we don't want that. Now, this is a public Git repo, so there actually is an issue with doing this, but you especially don't want to let people access this if you are using, for instance, a private repo. So we can update our Caddy config to actually ignore anything within that Git folder here. So over on the server, if we're in the etc Caddy folder and we edit the Caddy file, there is a section under file server called hide. So we can create our block for file server, and we can say hide, and we're going to hide .git. And it should be as simple as that. So I'll save this. I will then reload the Caddy server. So sudo service caddy reload. And now if I attempt to get that file, nothing is returned because Caddy is actually blocking access to that .git folder. So this is important to set up, especially if you have stuff in that folder that you don't want served up by Caddy. If you want to learn more, check out the Caddy docs specifically for the file server directive, and you can see more info about the hide option here. Now, for static sites, there might be some more configuration we want to do, especially for handling errors. So right now, since we hid that .git folder, whenever I try to request something inside of it, the server is responding with the 404, but it's not actually displaying anything on the page. And you can actually change the settings for that. So within the Caddy config, there is a section you can have called handled errors. And there's a few different things you can do in here. So you can look specifically for like a 404 error like this. So you can say, if there was an error code that matches within this range, then just respond with this text here. So there's a lot of different things you can do. One of the easiest things you can do, if you don't want like a super custom error page, is to just add a respond block here. So I'm actually going to copy this handle errors block, and then back over on the server, we'll edit the Caddy file again. And right below our file server block, we'll add the handle errors block. And so now anytime an error occurs, it's actually just going to respond with the status code and the status text. Now, this isn't going to be pretty. I'll show you right now. So if we reload the server and refresh the page over here, now it does say 404 not found. And like I said, it's not pretty, but if you do want to make pretty errors, you can actually look in the docs here and serve up like a custom file. You can define like your 404 error file or your custom error file, and automatically render that up instead of just the status code and the message. But for basic websites, this should be fine. And I definitely want to have this there just so I'm not getting back a blank page when an error happens. Next, I'll show you how to set things up if you have code inside of a private repo. So in order to read from a private repo, you need to at least have an SSH key that has read access to the repo. And specifically for GitHub, you can do that with deploy keys. So if you go into the settings tab here, and then scroll down to deploy keys, you can add keys here and give them read-only access or read and write access. And so what we can do is we can actually generate an SSH key on the VPS and then add it as a key here. So the VPS will be able to clone from this repo and pull the latest changes from this repo. Now, this is my preferred way of doing this. Essentially, you set up a SSH key for every repo that you want to pull from. You could, however, generate an SSH key and then just directly add it to your GitHub account. I would avoid that though, because if your VPS server gets compromised, then they have complete read and write access to every single repo that you have on GitHub. So I would avoid doing that. I would recommend that you use deploy keys. So to set this up, you're going to need to generate an SSH key on the server. I'll link to this documentation. You specifically want to click the Linux tab because we'll be generating this on the VPS itself, and then follow the steps for generating an SSH key. Now, like I just mentioned, you want to skip the step on adding the SSH key to your GitHub account, because if you add that key to your GitHub account, your VPS now has read and write access to every single GitHub repo that you have read and write access to. And we don't want that. We're going to lock it down to a specific repo. So whenever you generate this SSH key under this step right here, you should give it a unique name. And in this case, I'm going to generate a key and give it the name of the repo that I'm going to be cloning from, because every repo that I want to give this server access to, I'm going to generate a new key that has a unique name. So I'm going to go through these steps. I'll probably skip in the video, but I'll show you the relevant parts of where we're specifying a unique name. So over here on the VPS, I'm generating the key. I specified an email that I do have access to. And then for the location, I am giving it not the default name, but I'm adding the name of the website that this is going to be associated with. So I recommend you use like the repo name, just so you know specifically what that key is for. Because like I said, for every site that you want to clone in this way, we're going to generate a unique key. So that way that key is the read-only access to that specific repo. So I'll generate this. And now if you're following that doc, I'll need to add it to the SSH agent. And then the one part that's going to change is you're going to need to make sure that you actually specify the unique name of the file that you generated to add that to the SSH agent. Awesome. At this point, if we go into the .ssh folder here on my VPS, under the user account that I created, you can see that it has that private and public key. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add this public key as a deploy key. So if I just cat this public key, this is the key that we want. We'll copy it, and this is what we're going to add to GitHub. Now, like I said, technically, you could add this to your entire GitHub account, but then this user on this server would have read-write access to every single repo on GitHub that you have read-write access to. We don't want that. So over here on the repo, I'm going to go to Settings. I'm going to go down to Deploy Keys. I'm going to add a key, and we'll give it a name. We'll call this not localhost.net. Let's call it prod, and then put that key in there. Now, you can give it write access, but let's remember the principle of least privilege. This VPS isn't going to need to write to this repo. It literally is just going to need to pull the latest changes. So I'm not going to give it write access. I'm going to add that key. And now at this point, the server with the private key associated with this public key will actually be able to read from this repo. So now if we go back and we grab the SSH clone URL, this server should be able to clone from the SSH URL instead of the HTTPS URL. So now over here on the VPS, I've gone through the process of just creating an empty directory that my current user has read-write access to. And so now I'm going to clone into that empty directory. So if I do a git clone, specify the SSH URL, now it's going to attempt to clone in there. And because this is the first time that the VPS is trying to connect to GitHub, I do have to say yes here to store the fingerprint. But I should only have to do this the first time that this happens. And there we go. It cloned it into the folder. And if we go in there, all of the files are there. And if we try to visit the website, it loads just fine. So far, we've only set up static websites. Let's set up a dynamic website. And this site actually runs on node.js. So this is a simple little API that returns all the holidays from the Google Calendar API. And I want to get this up and running on the machine. But this API is built with Node.js and it requires Node.js to run. So I need to install Node on the machine. Now there's a lot of ways to do this. You could install it from apt, but I am going to use Node Version Manager because it's nice and easy to pick the version that I want to install. Now, on a VPS, technically, you don't have to install anything directly. You could just be using Docker. We're not going to use Docker in this video, but I have done a video on Docker if you'd like to learn about it. And everything I show about Docker can run on a VPS as well. But for this tutorial, we're just going to install Node.js directly on the machine. So here on the NVM repo, they have an install script. So I'm going to grab this, and then I'm going to run it here on my VPS. Now at this point, that installed NVM or Node Version Manager, and I need to source my bash RC so that way I can get access to the NVM command. So I'm going to do a source of that. And now when I type NVM, we get access to it. So what I want to do is I want to install the latest LTS, or the latest long-term support version of Node.js. So I'm going to do NVM install --LTS. And just like that, I have Node version 20. So if I do a node-v, I have 20. And if I do npm-v, I have version 10 of npm. Now, the way I installed Node.js, it's actually just running here under the CJ user account. And I like that because I don't want to run Node with super user privileges. That way, if the Node server is compromised, they only get access to my CJ account. They don't get access to root. But all the Node.js stuff just lives right here in this NVM folder. And so every version you install just lives here. And then we're going to be running all the processes under this CJ user account. Now that we have Node installed, I can set up this API on the VPS. Now, earlier we were putting all of our static websites in var/www. You can technically put these Node.js sites in there as well. Personally, I like to just put them in my home folder because they are running as the CJ user. So I like to make a directory called hosts or sites. And then inside of that directory, all of the dynamic websites I have will live in this folder, and they'll be running from there. So I'm actually going to clone the repo into this folder. Now, to do this, I am going to set up another deploy key. So we talked about deploy keys earlier, and I want to do this so that I can show you that we can actually have multiple keys. So right now, if I go into my .ssh folder, we have that notlocalhost.net key that we set up earlier, but I'm going to set up another key called holidays that will be specific to this Git repo. There we go. So I set up another key. You can see it's living here in this same folder, but now I can take this public key and add it as a deploy key. So I'm going to grab the public key. We'll copy this. And then over on the repo settings, we'll add a deploy key. So go into settings, go down to deploy keys, and then we're going to add a read-only key here. So we'll call this the not localhost server. Throw the key in and just make it read-only and then add it. Now, it's important that we created a separate key because GitHub will not let you use the same public key as a deploy key for two separate repos. So that's why for every repo we have read access to, we're going to generate a new key. So we've added it. Now I can clone it. So we'll go over here and we'll grab that SSH URL. And now because the CJ user running over here has that key, it should be able to clone it. So I'm going to go into that host folder and we're going to do the git clone just right here. Awesome. So we got it. And now we can set it up. So I need to install dependencies. And this API requires an env. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up. So it has the env sample. I'm going to copy that into env. And then I'm going to add my Google API key here. I'm also going to set node env to production because, I mean, technically we're running in production. We're running on a server here. So I'm going to grab my API key and then set it here. Great. So I set that up. I have dependencies installed. I should just be able to do an npm start. Okay, the server starts up. But remember, we have a firewall. So this server is running on port 5000. And right now, my firewall only has port 80 and port 443 open. So there's no way for the outside world to make a request to the server running on port 5000. So this is what a reverse proxy is for. So to set this up, we're first going to create some DNS records for the holidays API. The first one will just be holidays.notlocalhost.net. So we're going to add a record. It'll be an A type. The name will be holidays. The IP address will be our server. We'll disable the proxy and set it to 1 minute TTL. The other DNS record we'll add is the www subdomain of holidays.notlocalhost.net. So this is going to be www.holidays.notlocalhost.net, and we're going to point it to the same server. And the reason we do this is sometimes people put in www when they don't need to. So we're setting up this record so that we can redirect it back to without the www if someone were to type in www. So at this point, we have those two records, www.holidays and holidays, and they both point to our server. So let's set up the Caddy configs that will look for these specific host names. So over on the server, I'm in etc Caddy. We're going to go into sites available. And I'm going to go ahead and drop down into a root shell so I don't have to sudo all of these commands. And I'm going to edit a file. We're going to call this holidays API. Now, inside of here, I'll add my first server block, which will just be holidays.notlocalhost.net. And to load the node API, it's super simple. We just say reverse_proxy, and then we specify the port. And specifically, the holidays API is going to be running on port 5000. That's it. That's literally all we need. The other thing is we'll set up the redirect. So I'll add www.holidays.notlocalhost.net, and I want to redirect that to https://holidays.notlocalhost.net. And then we'll pass in the URI in case that was specified. This should be it. So let's close this. Let's save it. And now we need to link this Caddy file into the sites enabled folder. So we'll go up a directory. Let's go into sites enabled and we'll link it. So link, symbolic link, we'll specify the full path. So etc Caddy sites available holidays API. And then we're going to link that to etc Caddy sites enabled holidays API like this. So now the holidays API Caddy file exists within this site's enabled directory, and it points to the one in sites available. From here, we can reload the server. So if we do service caddy reload, should be good to go. And let's try it out. So in the browser, if I visit holidays.notlocalhost.net, it loads, but it's a completely blank page. If we open up the network tab, we should see status. Yeah, so 502 bad gateway because our Node.js app is not running on port 5000, so that reverse proxy right now is failing. Let's also try doing the www and make sure that redirect works. So if I do www.holidays.notlocalhost.net, it redirects to holidays.notlocalhost.net. Cool. Now, so far, so good, but we need to actually start up our Node.js app. But before we do that, let's actually show the error here because this is not great if we're just seeing a blank page. So let's add the errors block. All we're going to do is this right here. So if there are any errors, we actually want to see what that status code and what that status text is. So back over in our Caddyfile, we're going to edit that holidays API. And within this one, we're going to throw in this handle errors block. And so now, if, for instance, a 502 bad gateway error occurs, we should actually see that text instead of just a blank page. So I'll save this, then we'll reload the server. And now when I visit this, we actually see the text there. So you can get much more custom with this. You can serve up custom error files, but at a minimum, this is nice so that we're not just seeing a blank page. Now to get this working, let's just start up our Node.js app. So I'm going to exit this root shell, go into my home directory, go into holidays, and then just do an npm start. And so now the service is running on port 5000. And so if we make the request here, it should reverse proxy that request to the Node.js app running on port 5000 and actually serve up the data. Awesome. So now that we have the API running and it's reverse proxying and it's working the way we want it to, we want to keep it running, right? Because right now I have this shell open, and if I ever kill the app and refresh it, the app is down, right? So I need some way to run this. Now, technically, you could just use Linux command line foo and just like run this as a background task. But what happens if it crashes, right? What happens if a bad request comes into the server and cause it to completely crash? You want some sort of process manager so that if the server crashes, it will automatically restart and always stay up. Now, there's a built-in way in Linux to do this, and it's called systemd. I'll link to this article that talks about how to set this up for Node.js, but we've actually been interacting with systemd for Caddy. So Caddy is installed as a systemd service, and once you have something installed as a service, you can run service name restart, and it'll automatically restart it, or service name start, and it'll keep it running in the background. So this article here talks about how to do this for Node, but you can do it for any kind of application that you want to run in the background. And this is just built into Linux. Personally, I like to use a tool called PM2, which is a process manager. And now this will work with things that aren't Node.js as well, but it works especially well with Node.js applications. And they even have this idea of an ecosystem config file that you can commit to your source code, and it describes how the app should be run. And you can just say PM2 start, and it'll run it. I also like it because it has this nice little command line dashboard, which will show you all of your running services. You can start the processes, you can stop them, you can look at their logs. It's pretty cool. So I'm going to install this globally, and we'll use this to run the app. So I'm going to install this under the CJ user because that's where I installed Node. So if I do an npm install-g pm2, that should install it globally. And from there, I can start the process. So if I go into my hosts and holidays directory and then do a pm2 start, I can specify the file that it should run. In this case, it should be in source index.js. So this starts it up. You can see that it's running. If you do a pm2 list, this will show you all of your services. If you do pm2 logs and then the ID or the name of the service, it'll show you the request logs, or just the logs for the process. So you can see there that it's listening on port 5000. And now the reverse proxy should work. So if I refresh over here, it actually loads the page because it is able to reverse proxy that request. Now, there's a couple of other options you might want to do here. So if we do a PM2 list, we can see this is there. I'm actually going to stop this. So I'll do PM2 stop 0. That'll stop that process. And then I'm going to delete it. So PM2 delete 0. So that'll remove it from the list. And whenever you do a PM2 start, you can specify a name. And so you probably want to do this just so you can keep track of all the things that you have running. And I'm just going to call this the holidays API and then specify the file that it should run. So if I do that, now in the process list here, you can see it has a nice friendly name, and it's running in the background so we can still visit it and it still works. Now, PM2 also supports this idea of an ecosystem file, and it's just a JavaScript file that exports the configuration for how to run the app. So you don't always want to specify -- name from the command line. If you create this file, now you can just do PM2 start. It'll look at that file and automatically give it that name and automatically choose the script or whatever else. There's a lot of other options you can specify in here. And if for whatever reason you had 2 apps in a folder that need to be run, you could have multiple apps listed in here. Now, the holidays API that I just showed you was actually just JavaScript code. It didn't require a build process. I do want to show you an app that requires a build process because it's more likely that you're going to have an app like that. And I want to show you how we should run that app. So for this, I'm just going to use my Express API starter TypeScript template. And I'm not even going to create a custom API. I'm just going to clone this directly. We'll grab it over HTTPS. And then we'll clone it into the host folder. So if I clone this here, we now have the Express API starter TS. We'll go in there. We will install the dependencies. And then for this app, it actually has a start script, but let me show it to you because that start script just runs TS node. And we actually don't want to do this in production because TS node is dynamically transpiling these TypeScript files as requests come in. And we don't want that. We want to actually run the built app. And so you can see here that we do have a build command, and then we can run the built files from there. So if I do an npm run build, that's actually going to transpile all of my TypeScript into JavaScript codes. And then from there, I now have this dist folder, and the dist folder has just JavaScript files that need to be run. So I am going to run the code that's inside of there. So I'm going to cd into dist, and you can see that it's just the JavaScript, and it has that source directory there. And I'm going to use pm2 to start it. So I'll say pm2 start. We'll give it a name of example API. And then we'll specify source index.js. Cool. So now that's running in the background. Let's set up a domain for it. So over here, I'm going to add some A records. We're going to create example API, point to that IP, disable the proxy. You know the deal. You've seen me do this 5 times now. And then we're also going to add the www one. So www.example API, point to that IP. 1 minute TTL, save. Okay, so we have our DNS records. Let's set up the Caddyfile. So honestly, you should pause this video and try to do it yourself. You've already seen me do this several times now. I think you can do it without watching me. So I'm still going to walk through it, but I think you can do it without watching me. So go to etc caddy, and then we need to create another file in the sites available folder. And in this case, we actually can just copy the holidays API because it's going to be very similar. So yeah, I'm going to drop down to a root shell. And then I'm going to copy that holidays API into the example API folder or file. And then we'll edit that and we'll update the host names here. So we will call this example API not localhost.net. And then down here, same thing. We'll call this the www.example API.notlocalhost.net. And we want to redirect it to example API .notlocalhost.net. Now, we need to choose a port. I actually don't know what port the app runs on by default. Let's look at the codes. By default, it's trying to run on port 5000 as well, so it probably has errored out. I actually didn't even check. So I'm going to save this file for now, exit this root shell, and if I do a pm2 list, yeah, you can see that the example API errored out. And so this is a learning moment because we can just look at the logs. So if I do pm2 logs for example API, very likely it is having an issue binding to that port. It is. So we need to change that. So let me go into that host folder. And then in this example, we actually can specify the env just directly in this folder. There's a couple ways to do it. We actually could do it with an ecosystem file because we could specify our port environment variable there. But I'm just going to create a .env right in this folder because I know my app actually tries to load it in. So I'm going to set node.env to production. And I'm going to set my port to be something that's not in use. Let's just use port 6000. So I'll save that. And now we can restart that process. So if we list it out, it's here. If I do a pm2 restart of example API, we can also tell it to reload the environment. So if I do -- update env, that'll make sure that it's looking at the latest environment variables. And now if we look at the logs for ID number 1, it's running on port 6000. Cool. So from here, we can update our reverse proxy config to point to port 6000. So let's go back to etc caddy, drop into a root terminal. We're going to go and do sites available, edit that example API file, and then point it at 6000. Cool. And then we need to link this to the sites enabled folder. So we'll do an ln-s. Actually, we can do reverse search. So if you press Control R and then start searching ln-s, that will give you the command so we can update it. So we want this to be example API. We're going to link to example API. Cool. And so if we list the sites enabled folder, we should see Example API is pointing to the config that lives in sites available. Good to go. So now if we do a service caddy reload, it should have that config, and I should be able to visit example API.notlocalhost.net. Nice. And it's just a super simple Node.js API. I think we can go to API v1 and then emojis. Yeah, look at that. So really all I wanted to show you here is if you have an application that requires a build process, you're going to want to make sure that you run that. And then the process that's actually running on the server should be running the built files, not the TypeScript files. Next, I want to show you an example of a static website that requires a build process. So this is anything that might be using Vite or Webpack or Rollup or something that was made with like Create React app. Because at the end of the day, those apps actually just are static websites. Even though you might have a dev script and like you're using Node.js to run things locally, all of that is to turn your React files or your Vue files or your Svelte files into actual JavaScript code that can run in the browser. But when these kinds of apps are running in production, they're just static files. So let me show you how to set that up. So here I have just this timer. It's a React app built with Vite. Let's actually clone it down. Now, there are a couple ways to do this. You could build the files locally and then just transfer the built files to the server, or you could build on the server itself. And let's do just that. So I'm going to go into the var www folder because this is where our static websites live. And I'm going to create a directory called a big timer. And I don't have permissions, so I'm gonna have to do it with sudo, and then I'm gonna change the owner of that folder to be CJ, so that way I can clone into it. So I'm gonna chown it for CJ, and I need to make sure I do this as root. Cool, so now that folder is owned by me, and I can clone into it. So I'm just gonna clone this here. So it's by default, it was trying to clone into React Big Timer. I just want to tell it to go into the Big Timer folder. Cool. So now if we go into the Big Timer folder, we can see the actual source codes. And we need to create the actual built files, so we are going to have to install the dependencies here. Now, this is why you might want to build this app elsewhere and then just transfer the built files, because now the server is having to do the work of building our front-end app. But for this example, that's all I'm going to do. So we installed dependencies. Now we need to run the build script. So if we look in this specific app, it is a Vite app, so it has a build script that's just going to build it. So I'm going to do npm run build, and you can see that it generated these static assets. So this is a Vite app. It's at the end of the day, it's literally just 3 static files. It's an HTML file, all my CSS, and all my JavaScript, but it lives in this dist folder. So if we cd into dist, we can see this is the actual website that I want to serve up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print this directory, and we're going to create a static website config with Caddy that serves up this directory for the Big Timer website. So first, we'll go create those DNS records like we did before. So we're going to just call this Big Timer and point it at this IP address. We'll do a www record as well. It's getting old, I know, but I think repetition is good for learning. So we add another record, point it to this IP, disable this, save it up. Good to go. So I got those DNS records. Let's create the Caddy configs. So we're going to specifically create a static file website that points to this directory. We're going to go into etc caddy, and then I am going to drop down to a root shell and then create a file inside of sites available. We're going to call this big timer. Now we're going to put the domain, so big timer.notlocalhost.net. And we have to go grab the directives for a static file server, which I don't have memorized, so I'm going to go to the docs in a second, but I'll set up the other stuff. So www.bigtimer.notlocalhost.net should redirect to big timer. So reader https://big timer.notlocalhost.net. Great. And then let's go to the Caddy docs. So again, we talked about this earlier, but specifically we should go to directives. We're going to want to find that static serve directive, which is the file server. And then we can see some examples. So yeah, we want file server specified here. And then above that, we'll specify the root, say grab any file from that directory there. So this is going to be serving up the static files that live in that dist directory for Big Timer. So we'll save this. We're going to need to link it to the sites enabled folder like this. Cool. Now that we've linked it, we'll reload Caddy. So we'll do service Caddy reload. And let's try it out. So if I go to big timer.notlocalhost.net, we got a big timer. And the way this website works is you can pass in, let's say like minutes 5, and that'll just create a big 5-minute timer. Nice. Now, the main takeaway from this is if you have an application that is ultimately just static files, you should be serving it up as a static website. You wouldn't use PM2 for this React app to like run the dev server. That's just not what you want to do. You specifically want to build those files and then just serve it up as a static website. Now, that's it for all the example sites I'm going to show you. There's so much more we can do, but I do want to dive into some of the other concepts that you should take a look at for the Caddyfile. First of all, if you check out the concept section here on the site, they give a nice breakdown of what's inside of a Caddyfile. And what I have not shown is this idea of a global options block. So at the top most level of your main Caddyfile, you can add your main email that's used for like certificate renewal information. And you can also set your CA. Now, I didn't talk about this whenever we were setting things up, but you could set your CA to be the staging server of Let's Encrypt in case you're trying to test things out, because Let's Encrypt actually does rate limit your requests. And so if you mess things up, you might be locked out from setting up your TLS certificates. So here is where you can set that CA URL and then just practice with staging if you want to do that. Now, there's a bunch of other directives. One I want to point your attention to is the log directive, because by default, logging is not enabled for any of your Caddy websites. So you can specify the log directive. You can give it a name. And so in the logs, it'll have that name instead of the generated like log 0, log 1. And then you can specify an output. So you can just output to standard out or standard error, but probably the best thing you want to do is set up file output. So if you do output file, that will use a tool called Lumberjack to automatically output to a log file, and it automatically does log file rotation. So it doesn't just fill up your hard drive with logs. As they get to a certain size, it'll delete the old ones and write them to new ones. If you scroll down to the example section, you can see how they set this up. So for any site block, you can have the log directive and then say output file and then give it a directory to log to. You can also specify how big they should get before they roll over. Now, I'll also link you to their docs on how logging works, because they have some interesting ideas about it. So for most HTTP servers, they kind of have this standard log format, or the common log format. And you've probably seen this before in server logs where it's just like IP address and then info about the request. But Caddy likes to log things as JSON, and this gives you a lot more info about the request. And you can use tools like JQ, which will let you look at these files that have all of these JSON logs inside of them and actually query them in a useful way. And so whenever you set up output logging with Caddy, it's actually going to output these JSON logs to your file by default. Now, the last place I'll point you to is the common Caddyfile patterns documentation. And this has a bunch of just things that you might want to do inside of that Caddyfile. And one specifically that you might be interested in is the single page applications one. So far of all the static sites that I showed you, they didn't have like client-side routing. But if you have a static website that has client-side routing, you're going to want to set up this config right here. And so anytime you have a single page application with a client-side router, it's potential that requests to the app will 404 because those requests are handled by the client side. They're not handled by the server. And so this try files directive right here says any 404s should go to the index.html. And that's essentially how you set up client-side routing for single page applications. So be sure to do this. The other thing I didn't show, and it's an example for us right here, is you can actually set up compression. So if you set encode to gzip, that will make sure that all of your static file responses are using this gzip compression. Just like all the other videos, I've only scratched the surface. There's so much more we can do with the web server and the Caddy config and DNS records and everything else. So please, please, please let me know down in the comments, what do you want to learn about next? What should I dive deeper into? Now, I do want to say congrats to Matt Kilcup because he won a free t-shirt. So in the last self-host video, I showed the IP address of the server that I'm working on here. And if you visited that IP address in the web browser, it would just load the website that I've been showing you today, not localhost.net. But there was a link to a form where you could get a coupon code for a free t-shirt. And can you believe that Matt was the only person to do this? And so congrats to Matt, he got a free t-shirt. Now there's another place hidden in this video where you can find instructions on getting a coupon code for a free t-shirt. The first person to do it will get that. But I do want to note that it's hidden in plain sight. You don't need to hack into anything. You don't need to do anything malicious. there's something I've done today where you can see the instructions on how to get that free t-shirt, and the first person to do it will get it. All right, that's all I have for you. Please, please, please let me know. There's so much I wasn't able to cover and so much more that I want to talk about. So let me know, what do you want to see next? And I'll see you in the next one.